So we're going to be looking at suffering and friendship from the book of Job. During the peak of the COVID-19 lockdown, no visitors have been allowed to visit hospital, except for the following 3 reasons. These are the only reasons someone is allowed to visit a loved one in hospital. Firstly, relatives of those nearing the end of life. Parents of children who've been admitted. Or birthing partners, that is, husbands and partners of those who are giving birth. All of these people have been allowed to visit. And this last exception got me asking the question, why? Why on earth would a pregnant woman need the presence of her spouse whilst giving birth? Would she need her husband for his wisdom? Well, according to this book, you need to push. Would she need her husband for his advice? If you'd just stop screaming, we'd get through this a lot quicker. Would she need her husband for his opinion? According to Men's Health magazine, herbal tea is just as good a painkiller as that which that midwife recommends. We all know that husbands and partners are not required at the bedside for their wisdom, their advice, or their opinion. It's their presence that matters most of all. Presence matters, whether that be at the bedside, or at the funeral, or at the side of a person's side as they cry. It's the presence of another person, not necessarily their words, that count. Their presence might have no scientific benefit. Their presence may do nothing to reduce the physical pain. Their presence might not change the awful situation. But as you may already know from your own experience, the presence of a comforting friend can mean the world. Now, Job's 3 friends made the effort to be present with Job during his suffering, for they left their homes in order to be with Job. We read of this at the end of Job chapter 2. They joined Job in the ashes, as Job sat and suffered both physical and mental pain. At this time, Job did not need their wisdom, their advice, or their opinion. It was their presence with him that mattered most of all. Job wept, and so they wept. Job tore his robes, and so they did the same. Job sat on the ground and groaned all for 7 days and for 7 nights, and Job's 3 friends sat with him all that time. It is moving when our neighbour pops round to just say the words, "I'm thinking of you." It's even more moving when a friend pops a card around saying, "I'm thinking of you." And yet, it would be even more moving if our friend from Australia came to visit armed with 4 weeks of tissues, joining us in our suffering, despite living so far away. And yet the entire Christian faith is based on something even more moving: Christ leaving the comfort of heaven in order to share in this world's pain, rejoicing with those who rejoice, and weeping with those who wept. This was the motto that Christ lived by every day. And yet why? Why do we find it so hard? Why do we find it so hard to join people in their suffering? Well, Job in chapter 6 explains a little bit as to why. For Job's 3 friends, they turned from being good friends to not that being a great help. And Job hints at why. Job chapter 6 verse 21. Now you too have proved to be of no help. You see something dreadful and are afraid. Have I ever said, "Give something on my behalf, pay a ransom for me from your wealth, deliver me from the hand of the enemy, rescue me from the clutches of the ruthless"? Job's friends found it difficult to stay with Job in his suffering. For after silently joining him in his suffering, they stepped back, opened their mouths, and began offering him their wisdom, opinion, and advice. Job describes the reason for their withdrawal as fear. So why did Job's suffering make them afraid? Well, Job's suffering threatened their ability. They wanted to make everything right, but they didn't have the words or the ability. Job's suffering threatened their theology. Their theology couldn't answer the many questions that Job's suffering raised. But as Job goes on to say, he wasn't expecting them to be able to completely reverse his situation. He wasn't expecting his friends to give simple answers to the complex questions that his suffering brought to the surface. Job wasn't after these things. What Job was after was someone who was willing to listen to his questions and sit with him in his pain. And this is something all of us can do. When you see somebody suffering, don't avoid them. Just join them. And don't worry if you don't have all the answers, or if you don't quite know what to say. Join them, listen to them, and if they cry, you cry too. As Paul writes in one of his New Testament letters, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Now, don't worry if you aren't particularly much of a crier, or you aren't the best at dealing with emotions. The principle the Bible sets us is this: go and be with the person where they are. If they're in a place of sadness, do your best to share with them in that sadness. If they're in a place of joy, join with them in being glad. For some, this might mean listening, just listening, only speaking in order to acknowledge the other person's sadness or anger, only speaking in order to ask for more information so that you can better understand. It might simply mean sitting by someone's side as they cry, they vent anger, or silently grieve. Avoiding speaking during awkward silences. Avoiding speaking a sentence that attempts to put everything right when no such sentence actually exists. For some, this might just mean remembering what somebody told you last week and asking about it a week later. It might just mean a text, a card, or a phone call. It doesn't matter that you don't have the right, you might not know what to say. It doesn't matter that you're uncertain if now is the time is right. What matters is that you've done something to enter into the other person's suffering in an effort to show that you care. Put simply, meet the other person where they are at, be that in a place of sadness, joy, anxiety, or anger. Meet the other person where they are at, and if you're the person who's suffering, be willing to tell them where you are at. So firstly, meet the other person where they are at, and let them tell you where they are at. And secondly, open your ears and let them open their mouths. So, a couple of fun facts for you. Fun fact number 1, the book of Job contains the most question marks out of all the books in the Bible. For this reason, the word answer and the word answered appear numerous times in the book of Job. That's fun fact number 1. Fun fact number 2, the book of Job is all about Job asking questions and Job seeking answers, and yet no answer to the problem of suffering is given. Yes, the book of Job has a lot to teach us about suffering, teaching us about our need for faith and our need to trust God's infinite wisdom. But if you're after a short, simple answer to the problem of suffering, look somewhere else. It's not given in the book of Job. That's fun fact number 2. Not so fun fact number 3. Job's friends did not like question marks. They didn't like question marks. To every complex question Job asked, they had a short and simple answer. And Job's friends did not like Job's responses. Responses that reminded them that the problem of suffering is emotional as well as theological. Responses that reminded them that the problem of suffering is more complex than they thought. Job's friends opened their mouths, and Job told them to shut. Job's 3 friends opened their mouths and told Job to shut up. And in the end, at the end of the book, God condemns them for being foolish. God condemns their words for adding to Job's pain. Job himself in chapter 19 described their words as torture, saying, "How long will you torment me and crush me with words?" Their failure to listen caused them to answer Job in an insensitive way. Job described them as failing to appreciate his pain, saying in chapter 12, "Those who are at ease have contempt for misfortune." Their life of ease meant that they failed to understand the problem of suffering. If they had only listened to Job, Job would have taught them just how painful and how complex the problem of suffering is. Job described their words as adding to his misery. Adding to his misery. Because he just said, "I have heard many things like these. You are miserable comforters, all of you." Because they failed to listen and were only too willing to speak, their ill-thought words actually added to Job's pain. Job's friends opened their mouths and told Job to shut his. And this is Job's reply in chapter 13, verse 4. "You are worthless physicians, all of you." You know, every patient goes to the doctor wanting to be helped. However, if you go to the doctor with abdominal pain, the last thing you want is your doctor to come running towards your chest with a knife. Yes, a knife might be what's needed in the future. However, the doctor has to listen first. They need to listen to your symptoms. They need to press on your tummy and listen to you saying "ow." They need to listen for your permission so that they know so that they can ask your consent for an operation. They need to listen to your height and weight so that they know how much anesthetic to use before approaching you with a knife. A knife might be needed, but a knife thrust into someone's chest without first listening can do more damage than good. Now Job's 3 friends, they thrust their words and answers in Job's direction. But because they did not listen, their words did more damage to Job than good. Their words were insensitive, unthought out, and largely condemning. And such ill-thought words only added to Job's pain. So, helpful fact number 4. If you want to help anyone, you must listen first. Listen to them. Listen to them as they tell you about their holiday in Devon. Don't interrupt them so that you can tell them about your holiday in Devon. If you're not willing to listen to their holiday in Devon, well, they're never going to share with you anything deeper. Listen and resist the urge to butt in with your advice or your opinion. Listen and keep listening. Listening might be all that the other person needs. Listen and keep listening and keep listening. Rarely is a person's problem solved in a single sitting. Listen and take mental note so that you can sensitively reply if it's appropriate. Listen and resist the urge to give short, simple answers to the problem of suffering when no such answer exists. So let them open their mouth and let us shut ours. And thirdly, try to understand and be understanding. Chapters 3 to 31 are all about Job telling us where he is at physically, spiritually and emotionally. And chapters 3 to 31 are all about Job's 3 friends correcting every word that Job says. Job's friends criticize Job's emotional reaction. Now trouble comes to you, and you are discouraged. It strikes you and you are dismayed, is what they say in chapter 4. Job's friends criticize Job's theological precision. You even undermine piety and hinder devotion to God, they say in chapter 15. Job's friends criticize Job's focus on himself. You who tear yourself to pieces in your anger, is the earth to be abandoned for your sake, or must the rocks be moved from their place? Job's friends criticize Job for asking real and honest questions. Surely you know, they say, surely you know how it has been from of old. Chapters 3 to 31 are all about Job telling us where he is at physically, spiritually, and emotionally. But rather than trying to understand what Job is going through, Job's friends try and help Job understand. Job's three friends declare to Job, this is why you are suffering. This is how you should respond. But what is the real role of such a friend in this situation? Is the friend's role to understand them, to understand what it must be like to suffer? Or is the friend's role to help the other person understand every area in which they've gone wrong? Well, let's just go back to our birth-giving analogy before. Imagine the wife cries out in pain with tears in her eyes. The husband replies, pull yourself together. 9 months ago you said this would be the happiest day of your life. The wife cries out in agony, why the pain? The husband replies, have you forgotten last week's sermon from Genesis 3? Let me read it to you again and remind you that where birth pain came from. The wife exclaims at the top of her voice, I cannot go through this anymore. The husband replies, can I have that in writing? I'd like to use your words against you when you insist on having another child. You know, when a person is suffering, a person's thoughts, words and emotions can often be all over the place. They might say things that they don't mean, or say things just out of emotional anguish, rather than because they're actually thinking that thing. When a person is suffering, a person's thoughts, words and emotions are often all over the place. Their faith will often be all over the place as well. They might question God, express anger towards God, or just simply be confused about why God would allow this to happen. When a person is suffering, a person's thoughts, emotions and faith might be all over the place. And though there is a time for helping a person to understand their situation from God's perspective, the book of Job places a great deal of emphasis on something else. A friend's role is not, first of all, about helping the other person understand their situation better, helping them understand where they've gone wrong, or why their reaction is out of order, or how weak their faith is, or their lack of knowledge of the Bible. That's not the friend's role. You know, there's a time and a place for helping a person understand their situation from God's perspective. The Bible does encourage that. But remember, the primary role of a friend is about trying to understand their friend and their suffering better. And this is often the best way to help. As Job says in chapter 13, if only you would be altogether silent, for you that would be wisdom. As he says in chapter 21, keep listening to my words, and let this be your comfort. Job wanted to be understood. He wanted to be understood, not necessarily understand his situation better. He primarily wanted to be understood. So what does that mean for you and for me? Well, the first step to helping someone is trying to understand their situation better. To do this, we'll need to keep our mouths closed and let them open theirs. It means we need to understand that suffering can cause people to react in all sorts of ways. Trying to understand what they're going through, rather than constantly trying to correct their thoughts, their words and emotions. Understand that suffering can make a person be all over the place in regards to their faith. Make sure you listen, rather than trying to answer all their questions. Make sure you show understanding rather than criticizing them every time then what they say is not theologically correct. Meet the other person where they are at and let them tell you where they are at. Open your ears and let them open their mouths. And try to understand. And if you're the person who's suffering, be understanding with those who try but fail to help. For after Job's 3 friends had failed him, God spoke to Job these words. Chapter 42, verses 7 to 8. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, My anger burns against you and against your 2 friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer not to deal with you according to your folly, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Job's 3 friends had failed to understand Job or help him with his situation. And yet God also instructed Job to show understanding to his 3 friends. Job was to pray for them, forgive them, and restrain himself from laying into them because of their folly. Why? Because God shows compassion and forgiveness to the most imperfect of friends. And as an imperfect friend myself, I'm very glad that this is true. If there's anything the book of Job has taught me about friendship, it's that I often get it wrong. I speak rather than listen. I correct others rather than trying to understand. If there's anything the book of Job has taught me about friendship, it's that I often get it wrong. And for that reason, I'm so glad that God shows compassion and forgiveness to the likes of you and me. And so if you're the one who suffers, and others say something wrong, or get the timing wrong, or fail to show any concern at all, be like Job, be like God, be like Christ. Show understanding, compassion and forgiveness to friends when they fail.